Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have our special guest, Peter Pizzi, with us today. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. Your phones or your audio will be on mute. So if you have questions, and please, we encourage questions. There is a little box on the pane on the right for asking questions. So please type those in there, and myself and Peter will answer those as best we can as we go through. And then, of course, we'll save a little time at the end of the program for more questions and answers. This workshop will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on our VITA Learning website. Also, you will get CE for this, so if you do need CE, you should get an email about that. If you don't, please email us and we'll get that going for you. And again, we will be recording this, and look for us on our socials for other VITA Learning videos and webinars. And then, of course, if you have other questions that we don't get to during this program, please feel free to call us at our help desk. That myself, I'm Paul, or Jim, my colleague, can help answer any questions that you might have. And I am going to hand this over to Peter. And for those of you who don't know Peter, Peter owns his own lab, Pizzi Dental Studio in Staten Island, New York. He's been a technician since 1984 and is a CDT and MDT. He's a member of the American Academy of Aesthetic Dentistry and is the co-editor-in-chief of Inside Dental Technology. And today, he is going to be talking to us about the internal aesthetics for external beauty. So thank you so much, Peter, for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. Appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for showing up for another episode of our VITA Learning series that we're working through. It's funny because a lot of these topics, myself, and I don't know if you guys know Jim McGuire, we sat down and we took a lot of your feedback, people who are watching today, about questions you were asking, and that's where we kind of came up with all these titles. And to be honest with you, it's been kind of fun and challenging because they're all based on your thoughts and your questions, and I'm kind of working to them, right? I'm trying to figure out how to explain what you're asking or how to get to the answer of it. So one of them was internal aesthetics for external beauty. How do we start inside the crown to actually finish the final part of the crown? And the truth of that is there's a few aspects to it that we broke that down to. So for one, for me, it starts with tooth analysis. Really understanding what the tooth looks like. And I'll be honest and say, and I know this almost sounds a little sarcastic. I'm usually sarcastic, but I don't mean to be right now. I think as technicians, we don't really understand tooth form as well as we should. And I put myself into my own category there. I think really understanding form and the functional nature of it, there's definitely a dividing line about how much we know and what we do every day as compared to really understanding tooth form. So tooth analysis, I'll touch on a little bit in the first half of the series here today. Then frame design. And for frame design, I'm going to talk about a few different aspects of that. I'm going to talk about the optical versions of it and a little bit of the actual frames itself and how we work our substructures and our materials. And then the third part will be about internal frame treatment. How do we treat this frame or the substructure that we're going to be working with? So I kind of broke it down into these three sections to work through. So first, let's start with tooth analysis. And to be honest with you, I could probably spend about 5 days on tooth analysis. So to squeeze it into a few minutes is challenging, but the truth of it is really understanding what teeth look like is a study. It's an art, right? And I think for years I've always encouraged that people should look at nature and really take great pictures of natural teeth, have great study models, and even work as far as you can with real teeth. Seeing them, I have a jar on my desk with lots of natural teeth in that I use all the time to look at and reference, and have lots of casts that I use to look at shapes and forms that I like to apply them to my patients. So I call the tooth analysis is at 3 F's, right? In real estate, you have the 3 L's. I think it's location, location, and location. Well, with teeth, it's the 3 F's. And the 3 F's for me are about form, function, and both of those equal, I'm going to make up a word, aesthetics, just because I needed 3 F's in there. The bottom line is what I'm looking for is I really want to understand the form and its functional nature. And believe it or not, those two things really dictate the aesthetics, or we'll call it aesthetics for today, because it's really those two things that are dictating the final outcome, is that shape and form. And that part, I think, we tend to always think about it from what I call a one-dimensional point of view. And the reason I bring that up is because if you really look at teeth, they're not one-dimensional. Now, most of us, the average technicians out there, including myself, are what I would call somewhat one-dimensional or two-dimensional people as far as understanding of art and aesthetics go. Some people, and it's a very small percentage of our population, are three-dimensional viewers. They actually see things in a much more deeper sense of the word than we do. And I think that's important. And we actually teach this. It's funny, years ago, I spent a lot of time talking about this in lectures. I don't really anymore, but I do teach it in an NYU course that I, excuse me, in an NYU course that we give. And it's mostly doctors that take this program, but of course, in my technician hands-on courses, we go through this. So let me explain to you what it is quickly, just to help increase the concept of understanding what teeth look like, or relating what we see into natural form. And I call it aesthetic knowledge. And there's a few keys to aesthetic knowledge. The first key is the definition of insanity. Most of us know as you do the same thing over and over again and you expect it to be different. So you build up the same, you grind the same, you adjust the same, you put the same lines on, and at the end you think your crown looks better because you took a little more time. It doesn't really work that way. It's really about the knowledge that you add, and that would be number two. And number two is learning things, listening, being open-minded enough to really understand them, and then being able to apply them. I used to joke years ago in lectures that a lot of people who take lectures are head shakers, and those are the people who sit back and they shake their head every time you say something. And they say, yeah, I've done that. Yeah, I know that. Yeah, I've seen that. I've heard that. Yeah. But that doesn't mean you know it just because you've heard it. And it's really about the applying part that makes it really difficult. Third part is growth. And when I talk about growth, and I said starting off that we don't really understand form the way as well as we should. And again, it's an ever chasing battle for me too. I'm not going to pretend that my form is perfect. I'm always working on it. My feedback from my doctors and looking at photographs, it's something I'm always trying to improve on. But to improve it, you really have to have an appreciation and a growth. You have to be able to understand what you're seeing and study that process. And then the last part of it is really the full circle part, and that's coming together to see what you've built up, what it looks like on your cast, what it looks like in the mouth, and then it looks like as the patient speaks and talks. And it's all those things together that kind of make the circle, that bring an aesthetic understanding together. So the way we broke this down was a few years ago, I took a course with someone named Betty Edwards. And what Betty taught was really about understanding how to see things from a different perspective. Again, I'm not going to go too far into this today, really just for time, but I want to be clear, whenever I talk about form, it's how we learn to see it. That's going to be the key, and how we can transpose what we see into the actual work. So what Betty did was she broke down the difference between one-dimensional viewers and three-dimensional viewers, and she broke that down by talking about the left sides of the brains and the right side of the brain. The left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. And the reason that she did that was simply, some people view it what we call the logical side of their brain, or more of the left side of the brain. And basically what that means is what you see is literal. How you interpret it, it's already in there, and it's dominated by that left side analytical type of brain, where the people who are three-dimensional tend to be dominant on the right side of the brain, and they're more open to artistry and more open to seeing things in a bigger depth. So Betty broke this down so well, in one of her courses. And what she did was she tried to teach people that even if you're one-dimensional or two-dimensional, you can actually grow and see things. And the example I'll put up on our screen for you is in one of Betty's courses that she gave. And there's a book on this, by the way. There's many books on it. Also, there's a great online presence that you can Google Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain by Betty Edwards. And interesting what you'll see on the website. Again, I haven't taught this as much over the years, except for my NYU class, but I used to teach it a lot. And what Betty showed is she'd bring people in and she'd have them draw themselves with a pencil, and you get these very one-dimensional drawings that you can see here today. And then over a course of 3 days or 5 days, she would kind of break down that driven of the left side of the brain taking over what you see and starting to allow your natural ability to see in more 3-dimension come across. So the drawing that you're looking at right now is a drawing that a person did in day 1 of her course. And the drawing that you're seeing now is the same person who drew themselves 3 or 5 days later. And it's pretty impressive when you do that. So I'll show you a few more just quickly. This is day 1, a person came in and drew themselves, and day 5, the same person drew themselves. Kind of night and day, right? And really, what did they learn? They learned to see differently. They learned to understand dimension differently. And I'll show you one more. Person day 1 and person day 5. Kind of impressive stuff, right? So I've actually taken the course. My whole lab took it with me years ago, and it was a fun challenge to go through the process and really learn how to do it. And the way it really worked at the end was to teach us concepts to start to be able to look at things from a different perspective. So without going through too many of these beautiful befores and afters, let me break down the skills for you quickly so you can start to move this into how we look at teeth. The way Betty breaks down the skills is she talked about how 3-dimensional people don't really look at the object as well as they look at the entire surface and how it's defined. So what we would call that, or what Betty called it, was the perception of edges. Basically, when we looked at a form, we looked at where the edges were, whereas a one-dimensional person tends to see the flat of the beginning of the object, so the facial aspect of the tooth, or maybe just the line angles, where a 3-dimensional person tends to see the entire form all in that first visit, which is kind of that first view, which is kind of important. The second part of it, let me just move this, I'm sorry, because this is kind of blocking me. Okay. The second part of this is really the perception of edges or shapes. And so the first part is, the perception of edges, and the second part will be the perception of space. So what, again, a 3-dimensional person would really see when they look at not only the edges of the outline of something, but also what's not there, what's missing, what's around it, where negative spaces are. And they tend to perceive this a little bit differently than, again, most of us 1 or 2-dimensional people. Sorry, my thing is freezing up here. Let's see. There we go. Okay. And then the third dimension is the perception of relationships. For us with teeth, that would be, how does the incisal edge position relate to the lower incisal edge position? Or where are the teeth positions or angulations related to the other teeth positions that we're looking at? So it kind of changes that concept of just looking at a tooth and starting to look at the whole relationship about where it is. And then in that relationship, you have something called light and shadows. What that actually means is how one tooth might overlap another tooth, or how the angle of a tooth might change how the light hits it and reflects differently from the surface. So those are kind of, in a nutshell, very quickly, the rough concepts of what Betty taught. And she put it all together with a German word called Gestalt. And the point of this was you'd bring the concepts of each of these spatial relationships and light and shadows and negative space and edges all into one and start to look through the process to understand tooth form. So I would highly encourage you, if you have an opportunity, to buy Betty's book, look at it online, and investigate it a little bit more. I know it definitely helped me a lot with looking at my forms and my shapes. Okay, so now let's go back to the teeth version of this and start looking at the shapes and the forms. And the more, just hopefully saying that, I hope you start to look at the outlines a little bit differently and realize when I highlighted tooth, you can start to see all those little nuances that kind of come into the form of that tooth. And obviously every angle we change of that tooth creates a different dimension. And this is why understanding teeth form is so critical. And by the way, a little trick for you guys. If I've ever been in your labs, and I've been in a lot of them around the country, or I ever come in, one of the things that I always find interesting is people come up to me and show me their cases, and they say, what do you think? How does this look? What could be better? What can you change? And what's interesting for me is the first thing I look at is the lingual form. And the reason I look at lingual form is because if you don't have lingual form, I know you truly don't understand three-dimensional shape, because the facial form that you're looking at is really generated from the lingual. It's not generated from the facial. And I get all the excuses from all the technicians or all around the country or all around the world. Well, we don't make a lot of lingual form because our doctors don't want it. They want it smooth. They want it this way. Okay, you can still make it smooth, but if you don't understand the lingual form, you don't have facial form. Facial form is three-dimensional and it starts from the lingual concept. So when you look at a tooth, you have to understand that what's driving that tooth is not just what you see in that square box, but it's how it's formed in that three-dimensional circular position that actually allows you to develop something that's more natural. Great exercise for this, and I do this in a lot of hands-on courses, is where we can actually take natural teeth, we cut them out and make little roots out of them, and you can actually put them together on your own. You can actually put the incisal edges, the mesial contacts together, and as you change the position of the teeth, either by maybe flaring out the distals or dropping the distals in or overlapping one tooth over another, you can really start to develop a better sense for those perspectives of learning three-dimensional, right? You can start to see that outline of the tooth. You can see how overlap really creates shadow or changes the perception of how you see the size or the width of a tooth. So this is a great little exercise. If you ever have time to work on these skills, this is one of the ways that I know I try to do that. And you can also change the angles from the incisal edge point of view. You can see the difference in the embrasure spaces, how much tighter the teeth become. And again, in overlaps, I'd always argue that we as Americans aren't as great with overlaps as we should be. That's probably because we don't do enough of them. I think in Europe, you see a lot more of that, or at least I did in the years when I was training there more. Today, I think everybody's kind of gone into that straight white mold, but in truth, being able to create an overlap is really a sign of being able to show dimension. And I think an overlap is an important protocol for us to understand, especially when we're dealing with tighter arches or limited spatial room for teeth. The other thing is how we look at the tooth, even from the facial. I said the lingual contour is what's key, but from the facial, one of the challenges that we face all the time is not really understanding the width of the tooth. So there's two aspects. When we're marking our teeth with our pencils, we're using the side of the pencil, and we're looking to highlight the line, the heights of contour or the line angles. I'm not looking to draw lines on the teeth. I'm using the flat of the pencil, as you can see here in the photograph, and I'm using that to give me where the tooth's height is so I can have a real understanding of its relationship. Problem is, though, that doesn't really give you the full volume of the tooth. That gives you what we call an optical volume. And that optical volume is really nothing more than the area of the tooth that has the greatest ability to reflect the light. And that's usually from line angle to line angle and in the middle of that. But that is not really the volume of the tooth. And the volume of the tooth, as I said to you before, is more about the three-dimensional shape and that three-dimensional form that starts on the lingual. So there's an optical volume and a real volume. And in truth, your job is to understand both of those. And the way I describe them is the optical volume is the greatest width area of light reflection, whereas the real volume is really the full shape of the space it occupies, or the space that that tooth takes up. And obviously they're very different. And this is why it's really critical for you to understand that lingual form, that lingual contour. So again, looking at teeth from all directions and three-dimensional is really the best. And one more little trick I'll give you is besides for understanding not only the three-dimensional form, buccal, lingual, mesial, and distal, but also the three-dimensional form as far as angulation goes. And if you notice on this particular slide, if I look at a natural tooth, you're going to notice that there's three actual planes on the facial of that tooth. So you have that gingival plane, that middle third, and that incisal plane. And each of those planes are not only as important for us when we're trying to emulate nature, but really critical for our doctor partners to be able to prepare a tooth to allow us to get those angulations in their form and their prep design. So again, it's that team effort that kind of matters. And I said to you that one of the things that I try to do is incorporate not only the form into the final aesthetic, but I also have to understand that each of these forms play a role for me in not only the shape and form, or the phonetics as we call it, but then also the true aesthetics of the colorations, which is the value, the chroma saturations, and the incisal translucency. So I'm trying to put those all together into kind of a big bowl as I'm looking through my restorations. And I'll give you one more little tip for a practice point. Another thing that we do in hands-on courses or in my NYU program is we actually take pictures of teeth, or we cut out little tooth forms, and you can see these are placed over a old school wax block. So this is just old school carving, and we'll go from the facial to the lingual to the mesial and the distal. We'll mark that out in wax, and then we'll practice carving in three-dimensional forms. And again, I can't tell you this is nothing better than really actually doing it for real and studying the process. And as you go through that, it really helps your form, whether you're working with wax or ceramics or composites, or even in milling world, where you can really start to shape. Now, I get it, in milling world, they're giving you some of the forms. That doesn't mean the form is right for that particular patient. And what separates you from the other technicians or from the other laboratories is the ability to know and to make tweaks and changes into the forms to fit into that individual patient. Okay, part two. I'm sorry I went through that really quick, but usually that's a few day part of a course. Anyway, the second part would be understanding the frame design, but the frame design for me is going to be really more about the optics at this point. So I want to talk a little bit about how light works and how light interacts as I'm looking at my restoration. So let's start by what I always start with is my canvas. And whenever I'm trying to build teeth to emulate nature, I follow very similar steps over and over again. And what those really are is I want chroma in my gingival area. I want value in that middle third. And then that age of that incisal edge really has to do about the age of the patient and my interpretation of, do I want a lot of translucency, a little translucency? It's really about putting all of those things together. So I'm always building from what I would call a canvas concept. I'm assuming most of you have heard me say that a billion times. But that doesn't change when I start to go into the world of form, right? Because what I'm really looking now is to apply that canvas concept to the rough forms of the teeth. So I'm going to look at my tooth. I'm going to try to look at the lines and edges. I'm going to try to look at where the shadows and the negative space is. And I'm going to really apply that into where I'm layering that chroma and that value and that incisal translucency. So again, it all ties together. But the key to this tie is really going to be in the light transmission. And what I mean by that is, for those of you who have dealt with the challenge of single centrals over and over again, I have 3 of them on my, actually I think 4 today. I have 4 single centrals and a lower arch on my desk behind me right now that I'm working on, and that lower arch is due for tomorrow morning, by the way. As I'm working through my processes, I'm kind of always thinking about the same thing, is all that form, I want to get the layering right, but also I want light transmission to work. And what you'll notice in this photograph is there is a substructure or a coping over a natural tooth. And you'll notice that that substructure creates what I call a shadow over the root itself. And believe it or not, that's one of the biggest flaws that we have with dental materials, is that they're not optically the best for us to transmit light the way we have to. In order for us to really get the light to transmit, we kind of need fluorescence, or we need more or less opacities or more or less translucencies, but it's different in every circumstance. The one that is the same all the time is that the minute you put a substructure over a natural tooth, zirconia, metal, or lithium silicate, even when they're translucent type materials, they still create shadow. And it's that shadow that tends to make the gingival harmony look not as good as it does in nature. And in truth, one of the reasons our single centrals stand out as being fake restorations is not necessarily the coloration of the tooth or the value. It's really about how it harmonizes with the gingival, similar to the natural tooth next to it. Creating that harmonization is really a challenge. So the right way to do it is to understand light. And if you look at a natural tooth, you can see this is a prepared tooth. And when I light the tooth up from behind, look at how much light actually travels up the root and into the gingival tissue. And think about that from a restorative point of view. Not only do these teeth transmit light into the root, but they also have a high bit of fluorescence to them. And those two things are, again, what we're fighting against, especially in single central world or 2-unit world, where we really have to tie our restorations into nature. So for me, the solution is a simple one, and it's an old school solution. I don't like margins in my substructures. And one of the things I started doing years ago, and I studied with Don Cornell and Willa Geller and Michelle and all the great people that I was lucky enough to study with, it was really about getting rid of the substructure and allowing more light into the actual tooth itself by using marginal materials and fluorescent materials that push light. But it's not just for metal, and I kind of wanted to review that a little bit with everybody today. You know, I do it in metal ceramics, of course, and I still do a large amount of metal ceramics, but I also do it with zirconia. And I even sometimes do it in lithium silicates if I need to really get a little bit extra light in and out of the root of the tooth. Now, the reason this is so critical is because, yes, I get it. The more translucent zirconias do allow more light into the tooth than the other ones that were the older zirconias that we used. But is it enough? And does it not still create a shadow? So I did a little experiment that I'm going to kind of show you how that works, to show you how each of the materials can transmit light because they're getting better, but still on their own intraorally, they don't always have what they need. So let me give you a little example of that. I took a few different materials. This is a Mark II material, which is probably one of my favorite materials today. It's a VITA material. It's a feldspathic material. It's not zirconia or lithium silicate. And what I did was I milled this material. It's pure feldspathic. And you can see the mill on a natural tooth. And then I actually glazed and fired that tooth and put it on the natural tooth and lit it up from the back side or the lingual side. And you can see how nice light transmission I'm getting with pure feldspathic materials. You're not going to see that in every material. Again, this is a pure feldspathic material on a natural tooth, and you can start to see right away that I'm getting a good amount of light transmission. So even feldspathic materials in nature can give you some light transmission. When you get into other materials like lithium silicates and D-silicates, a little more challenging. This one does work pretty well. This is Suprenity, and Suprenity has a nice ability to transmit some light, and you can see it's not as much as what you saw before, but definitely a little bit of light transmission and not too much shadow being created. And each of those, especially the newer materials like the Ambria, again, same scenario. I'm trying to find out which materials can transmit light for me as well as possible without me having to cut everything back. But once I get into any zirconia material or even some of the more opacified lithium silicates, I'm going to struggle with that, and I'm going to really want to cut those margins back. So here's a perfect example of the zirconium material. This is the ST, VITA zirconia, and you'll notice that I actually cut the entire facial margin back. Personally, I like 360 ceramic margins, but I know people struggle with them and it takes a little while to get comfortable. So starting off with the 180s are okay, especially with zirconia and the more translucent zirconias. But what I'm going to want to do here is I'm going to want to utilize a marginal material to give me a little more fluorescence to help boost some of that light into the tooth and create a little bit of a different effect. So what I did as an experiment that I mentioned to you a while ago was I took 2 copings, and one of them I didn't cut back at all. I actually left the zirconia right to the edge of the margin. And the other one I cut back and I put ceramic margin material on it, again, high fluorescent. And then I put them both in the mouth and I took some photographs with some light behind the teeth so you can actually see what's happening behind the teeth. And you'll notice that the zirconia that's uncut has a very dark shadow. Now, in fairness, that tooth was a little darker, so it's probably exaggerated. But look at the restoration that has the ceramic margin. Look at how much more light is going up into the gingiva itself. So really all I'm trying to do is help push some of that light up in there. And the best way to do that, ceramic margin materials. So I'm a big fan of margin materials. I use them all the time. And again, just a little experiment to show you the difference of how much more light is getting up into the root as compared to how much gets shadowed when we have any sort of substructure over the tooth itself. So that kind of handles some of the optics of the material. Now, let's look at that in a real life case. This doesn't have a subframe, so this is pure feldspathic ceramic. But as I walk through the process, I'm thinking of the same premise over and over again. So I won't bore you with the entire case. Patient came in just for they wanted 2, 4, 6 veneers. They weren't really sure. We wound up treating it as a 4-unit veneer case because we felt that was really best to manage it. So we did our normal diagnostic wax up, provisionalize the patient to close some of the spaces and improve some of the shapes. And then we'll start with the basic concept of ceramic layering that I would normally go through when I'm teaching ceramics. And what are those? Well, those are basically working with, for me, a refractory cast. A lot of times I'm working with refractory because I want to work on my emergence profile and have that soft tissue for me to really manage my way through and understand the emergence. So for me, the refractory is still the best for that. If I'm working with machined materials like feldspathic Mark II, which is a pure feldspathic ceramic, do I still need this type of model? No, I don't, because now I have the ability to have a die model that I'm transferring my final restoration on to a solid cast afterwards, which has the tissue on it for me. The bottom line is whatever I work on, I want to work on a tissue cast. So if I have tissue that shows me where the emergence is, where I need to apply pressure or how to manage that emergence out of the tissue, I'm comfortable. The way to get that best for me with refractory is obviously on an alveolar cast, a removable die cast. But that gets really complicated. So the beauty of the milled materials is I can now work on a solid cast without having to go through this entire process over and over again. But this was an old school refractory case. And I'll just quickly walk you through the build-up that I would normally do for something like this. In this case, I could use either a margin material to get my reflective index a little higher or push that light a little bit more in the cervical, or I could even use a liner material, which are also highly fluorescent and a little bit more grainy than the normal ceramics that you tend to use. And I'll use that to do all the things in my basic canvas, increase my chroma and light transmission at the cervical, push the value in the middle third, and maybe extend the tip of the coping or the tip of the prep to give me a little bit more opacity and not just have that hard edge where the tooth kind of ends or the substructure ends for me there. And then I'll go into my dentin build-up. Now, you guys have seen me go through this a billion times, I'm sure. I use a higher chroma dentin, then I shift to a brighter dentin or a higher value dentin. And then obviously I go back to a little lower in brightness dentin or a third dentin that'll help me drop some of that value down as I get towards that incisal edge. So an example, if I was looking for a A1 or a 1M1, what did I use here? I probably used 1M2 or A2 cervically. I probably used a bleach powder, OM3 or maybe even OM2 in the middle third, and then probably went to the 1M1 or the A1 towards that incisal edge. So I'm trying to create those different zones of values in the restoration itself. And then obviously I'll finish that off with my translucence materials. That could be any bluish kind of effect that you like. I like the water drop or the EE9, or sometimes I mix EE9 and EE10. And it depends on what system I'm using or what material I'm building with on that particular case. After that, I'll apply my mamelon materials, and we broke this down a lot in the last webinar. If you haven't seen that, you might want to go back and watch that one. And I'm going to use 1, 2, or 3 different mamelon materials, depending on the actual case that I'm building, but not my focus for today. And then I'll cover over that with my secondary dentins and my translucents. But the end goal is I'm trying to create exactly what I showed you from the beginning. I want to create that gingival warmth. I want to create a brightness in the middle third. And then I want the age or the incisal edge to be really about what I'm trying to create for that particular patient, a younger looking tooth or an older looking tooth or a middle-aged looking tooth. And I think it's important that we know the difference of all those aspects of the teeth. Okay, so I'll cover that with my basic enamels. Sometimes I'll add a little bright white enamel here, but again, I did cover this in the last webinar, so you can go back and watch some more of that with the other webinar. This one I want to stay focused on the topics that we brought into today. I'll cover that with my final enamel. I'll fire that. You can see we can get a fairly nice looking aesthetic look out of that, very simple, maybe about 8 to 10 powders. I've got some chroma, I've got some value, and I got some translucency. But now to tie that back into what we just talked about, I want you to notice what happens when I go to place this in the patient's mouth. We're going to take one restoration, but we're just going to slide this up. And notice the color of the gum tissue right away as we're sliding this restoration into the patient's mouth. Look at it on its own, and you can see that it's a little beat up at this point, right? We're taking the provisionals off. Maybe there was a cord pack in there before cementation. Watch what happens when we slide that restoration up under the gum tissue, and how nice and healthy the pink tissue looks, and how you can actually see that the light restoration is kind of traveling more through the tooth rather than just on the face of my crown. And this is why the optics are so critical for us to manage that. We'll place all those final restorations. Unfortunately, our patient's still numb there, so maybe not the greatest comfortable smile at this point. And these papillas will definitely fill in the next hour or two. This is taken immediately upon insertion, so the patient was still a little bit numb. You can actually see the papilla popping in a little bit already here, just in a few minutes of photograph. So it's kind of nice to manage that. And that's the finals. And fairly happy patient, I think. You can see again, numb. So when the patient's numb, it's a little more challenging. And now let's take the third part of what we were talking about. So for me, I'm trying to work my way through each part of the topics here in this quickly. And the last part now is we talked about form. We talked about the optics of the frame and what's important for that. And now let's talk about the materials and how we can utilize materials on the frame itself to help. But I'm going to break that down actually into two parts. So I'm going to half this part a little bit. And what I mean by that is I already told you that one of the materials I would use is a margin material because of the fluorescence. And I would use that margin material in lots of areas or liners. And again, covered that in our last session that we did. But the other area that I'm looking for is to utilize either the frame or the material to support the final outcome of the restoration. So what do I mean by that? If you're in a large lab format and your frame designs are, let's say, a little on the weaker side, meaning that you're getting kind of a coping with not much structure to it, well, then you as a ceramist need to do a little more work to make that pop and make that have the value you want. So how would I do that? One, again, I would go straight to either my margin materials or liner materials to get that marginal integrity that I need for the optics. But then I would also use some of those similar materials, like margin materials or liners, to actually start increasing the value in the areas of the tooth that I want, or lowering the value in areas I want, like on the incisal edge. So you can see here, I'm actually using 3 liners or 3 margin materials. Either one is fine, to actually start to create that frame internally. And by the way, I always have a pet peeve with this because every lab that I've taught in the last 10 years gives me the same concept of, well, when we have zirconias, we do a wash bake on it first. Everybody does a wash bake a different way. But in the end, you're all doing some sort of a wash bake. Well, that is my wash bake. And my wash bake is a little more involved. I'm actually treating it like a powder build rather than just putting a wash on a coping. But I'm going to tell you that wash does 0 for you. It really adds nothing to the final restoration except for the wasted 50 minutes while it's firing in your furnace. So spend the extra 2 minutes and do a little bit of a build up on that area. This way you can actually get a little bit more structure on the coping itself before you go to the next level. So this is what my substructure would look like. If I'm building it, there's my gingival coloration, which is a higher chroma, my value in the middle third and up and down the line angles, and then some sort of a bluish grayish effect around the lingual aspect of my tooth, so I can make it appear like there's more depth in that. I'm sorry for the little background noise. And that's what my final frame looks like at this moment. So you can see this is a built-up frame, not a subframe. I'm actually building the frame up with my ceramics and my powders. This way I can really create what I need. Close that door. Okay, and that's what my final frame would kind of look like, right? So that's all built. And what's nice about it is I'm using that as my canvas to start my dentin, my middle third, and my translucent layer. And that's kind of a real great way to start. But that's not the only way, right? That's kind of the way I explained more in the webinar in the last session that we did. The other way to do this is to manage it not only from the powder point of view, but to manage it from the frame itself point of view. And what I mean by that is when I'm looking at my frameworks, I can design them similar that way in my designing process. I don't always have to count on just the powders to do that. So I could actually start my framework. Let me go back one or two, I'm sorry. I can actually start my framework that already looks that way in my design. So in this framework, what am I doing? I'm going to try to give myself a little bit more space for material on the cervical third, but I might actually bring it out more in the middle third of the restoration or up and down the line angles and use the material as more of a reflective material or an absorbing material, depending if I'm using a higher value zirconia or a more translucent lower value zirconia. So I'm doing that design very similar, either in digital world or in layering world. I'm treating them both the same. So again, this only makes your layering a little easier, right? Because now I don't need as much powder as I go over that to get the same effect. I can use very small amounts of powder and almost get the exact same effect that I got before by just using the frame itself to control that. So let me give you a better example of that. And I'll skip through this part of it quick and get right to the example I wanted to provide for you. So here's the perfect example. Let's take a whole case and we'll kind of walk it through. It's going to be a 3-unit restoration. This was the model I was using in courses a lot the last few years. And you're going to notice right from the get-go in my design what I'm trying to accomplish. What am I trying to accomplish? I'm trying to allow myself space for the right material cervically. I'm trying to push the middle third out so I can get more light reflection or more value or light bouncing off in that middle third, and even more up and down those line angles, that kind of a little height of contour effect in the substructure itself. And what that allows me to do then is rather than go through a heavy layering process, I can actually just use a very thin wash of now liner materials or margin materials, either one. And I don't have to layer as much in the design. So I'm going to use a higher chroma liner material or margin material here, a higher value material here, and then again, up and down the line angles. So that allows me to fire that. And you can see right away that a very thin wash, look at how much color I can generate on those restorations because the frame is already supportive of what I wanted to do. So a thin wash, and you can see I bounced out the chroma, I bounced up a lot cervically, a little extra on the lateral, and then in the middle third, I bounced up the value. One of these copings is going to be fully layered, so I have no lingual backing, so I didn't need to do much else to it. But on the coping behind it, on the lateral coping, you'll notice it's a lingual contour. And I used some blue-gray type materials here to create the feel of depth or translucency on the outside or the inside of the restoration, okay? And then again, same thing after that. A higher chroma dentin, a higher value middle third dentin, and then back to a normal value dentin towards the incisal edge to finish off that restoration. Go back to my frame material, again, covered in the last webinar, where that's usually a blue-gray type material, and then back to my Mamelon materials to create that whole interface that I'm looking for there. And you can see again how that works with light. Remember, one is a lingual zirconia restoration, and one is a fully layered restoration. But even at this stage, look at how similar they look. You don't really notice that this is lingual zirconia, or notice that this one is fully layered, right? You're getting a very similar light effect on them. And that's because I'm controlling that on the internal aspect of it. I'll finish that off with my enamels as always, and then I'll fire the 3 of them. Sorry, my voice is so breaking up today. But again, look at the similarities in these. Remember, one is a fully layered and one is just a micro layered. And yet I've got just as much effect and translucency on both of them. Maybe a hair more chroma here on the lateral, but otherwise I've got really the same effect. And that's all because I controlled the color more from the inside and the outside of the restoration. So I'll give you one more example of that. This was actually a cast that I used in London a few years ago in a course that I did. It was a a 3-day live hands-on course. And during the course, we built pink and white. But I'd like to show you again how I broke down that framework so you really get a feel for how I can manage that internal aspect of it. So here is the diagnostic wax up that we did for the course. And you can see that I took that wax up and I broke it down into 2 full coverage, fully layered centrals, and then 2 partially layered or micro layered laterals. And that changes the scale for us. And by the way, this is so important today, right? Because I don't think any of you out there are working on the exact same spacing of all your restorations. Kind of everything you do today is 1 micro layered, 1 full coverage, 1 implant. And it really changes the game of how you approach your layering and your processes or your management of the internal substructures. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this restoration the way you see it. And here, again, here's my wax up. Notice the details. I've created space to give me room to create chroma and depth. I've created a protrusive area that pops out so I can get more light reflection in those areas. And then also when I get to that middle third of the incisal edge, I've got a lot of ins and outs that help me with that transition of light from the dominant line angles to where I want more translucencies. And here's a better look of what that looks like up close. And I think it's funny because even in the wax up, you can really kind of see it, right? You can really see how the light reflects differently from different surfaces or how the light gets absorbed in different surfaces just based on a simple frame design. That becomes my zirconia. This is the ST zirconia from VITA. It's actually one of the first cases I did with it. And I want to make sure I can mill that very similar to what either copy milling or designing. So meaning that your milling machine has to have a good quality to get to those little details and really work in a fine state. And then here's all I did out of that mill. I took that mill and the wash that you did, I probably did very similar. I took a few liner materials and I increased my chroma on the lateral because I had less room to work with. I used a normal chroma, maybe an A2 or A3 around the cervical here. And I also put a little bit of a wash material on the middle thirds of the teeth just to help brighten them up a little bit. And now it really is a true wash bake. And now I can get away with that concept of a wash bake because my substructure is supporting so much more of what I'm doing. And then again, simple dentin system, right? Then I'll go back to my dentins, chroma, value, incisal edge, age related. My mammalian materials over and over again, very similar to what I always do, trying to make sure that I'm breaking the light up where I want it to appeal. And remember, in this particular case, this lateral, both laterals that you're looking at are monolithic linguals. So they're just micro layered, whereas the centrals are fully layered restorations. And at this point, you shouldn't notice any difference in how they appear under light. I mean, to me, that's kind of cool, right? If I'm really looking at this from a scientific point of view, this has nothing but ceramic surrounding almost 50% of the entire tooth, where this has zirconia covering the entire 100% lingual of the tooth, and I'm just putting ceramics on the facial aspect of it. But yet you should see no difference in the light transmission on any of these. And it's all about managing the contour and managing the materials you put on there. So here's what you're seeing. Started with chroma and design from the inside, dentins and mammalian materials. And I finished that up and kind of did it in one bake, to be honest with you, only because for those of you who know me, I speak too much. We started to run out of time. I think even on a 3-day course, we were trying to match one of the participants' teeth that were in the course. Her name was Rachel. We came close. I think we were a hair bright at this point, but that was one bake. I would come back and actually do another bake on my gingival and maybe get a little bit more of a warmer translucency there. But in the end, we got close considering it. Now, I said one bake. I'm not one of the guys who pushes that you should be doing everything in one bake. I know a lot of my friends talk about one bake and how critical it is. I think 1, 2, or 3, depending on what you need, is fine. We did one because it's all the time we had, and it just worked out that way. And we, I spent a lot of time teaching and talking, and the participants had to build it up too. But in this particular case, why could I get away with one bake? Because the frame was designed properly. I was able to get away with it because my substructure allowed me to have less space and utilize that substructure to give me what I needed in the ceramic without having to add 2 or 3 millimeters of ceramic everywhere I went. And that's really the difference of why I was able to kind of manage it as that one big process. So with that said, I'm going to assume we're just about on time. Let me look at my watch here. Yeah, 12:50, perfect. See, Paul, I'm right on time again. So with that said, I know I rushed through a little bit of that. It's kind of my nature. I'm sorry. You guys are probably used to hearing me flying through things. I'm always trying to cram in a lot of information for you. So hopefully you grabbed onto all of that. I think to just recap, form is key. Learn it, study it, work on it, try to master it. It's for the rest of your life. It never ends. Then understanding the optics, and the optics are about managing the materials you use to get true light transmission in and out of the restoration. And then a third part of that is, or the third part, parts A and B, would be one, managing the frame itself to allow the different obstacles in your material to work for you, meaning to reflect light or absorb light. And then part B would be using your ceramic materials to emphasize all the little things that we just talked about on that subframe. So I hope I covered that well for you guys. I appreciate the challenges of the topics you keep throwing at me. They're kind of fun. And when you have any questions, Mr. Paul, please let me know.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. That was fantastic, as always. We've got a couple of questions here. The first one is, when you're using the Lumex, what are you layering the margins with?
Yeah, so good question. So the Lumex kit, the margin materials are still in the works. They are coming down the pike. I'm actually using the margin materials from the VM9 system right now. They fire much higher, obviously, but that's actually a cool thing because they're firing higher. And then I'm going to the low fusing Lumex material, which really makes it a lot nicer. So I got a real stable margin, and then I can build up normal over the top of it.
Terrific, thank you. And do you recommend a wash bake over sandblasting to prepare for your buildup?
So the question's a little tricky the way you're asking it, and I wanted to make sure I explain it well. So first, I'll break it down. Of course, I sandblast the substructure. I sandblast the heck out of it, even though manufacturers say you shouldn't. I want surface. I want that material to grab onto the surface as best I can. So yes, I sandblast. The second part is, I hope I was clear enough with you on what I consider a wash bake as to what you consider a wash bake. I don't take ceramics and wash them over my coping and fire them higher. I don't mix dentin in this material and put that. I don't do any of that. I don't believe there's any value to it, to be honest with you. What I do as my wash bake is I build liner material or margin material on that substructure, and that is my wash bake.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you, Peter. I appreciate it. Looks like that covered most of the questions. I am going to jump back over here real quick.
I have a question. How's the California weather doing?
It is
perfect.
Hot and sunny. Yes, yeah, it is beautiful. It's just starting to warm up, and which is crazy. I had some of my Canadian friends tell me that it was snowing up there last week. So wow. it's hard to wrap your head around the different weathers. But yeah, it's been beautiful.
I'm looking forward to being there in a few weeks.
Yeah, well, we'll look forward to having you. So if you guys have any questions about the products themselves, you can contact your VITA representatives. And then again, for more learning opportunities, we have more stuff from Peter coming up, several different things and several different dates. Please look for a full list on our VITA North America website for courses.
And anybody and again, I'll be in New Orleans, I think, in 2 weeks for a show there. I hope to see a few people out for a real audience again. I'm excited. And then I think I'll be in California and Seattle the weeks after that. So I'm actually really looking forward to see some faces and be in front of not a computer screen anymore.
That'll be terrific. We got a couple of last minute questions here. The first one is what temperature do you fire your wash bake?
So again, I'm correcting whoever's saying wash bake. Remember, wash bake is not a wash bake the way we used to describe it, right? Not washing little ceramic on it. My wash bake is always either margin material or a liner material. And both of those fire higher than the normal dentins. So if it's, let's say if it's in VM9 as an example, VM9, the margin materials fire at 940, whereas the dentin fires around 910. In the Lumex, the margin materials will fire a little higher, probably in the 770, 7080 range. I'm not 100% sure where those will fall yet, but I can go back and use the VM9 materials in there. So I'm always firing them higher, but I just want to make sure you guys are clear to break that concept of what you consider a wash bake and what I consider a wash bake.
Got it. Okay. And one more. Is the canvas concept the same for a metal substrate?
100%. I use that canvas concept on everything. And by the way, I also alter the framework on metals, not only marginally, but I don't mind bringing the metal out a little bit in that middle third to get a little more bounce back and modifying my opaque there, or designing more of a structure towards the incisal edge and modifying it in the opaque layer. So yeah, I'm not really changing, the substructure doesn't change in my buildup at all. I'm kind of keeping the substructures more uniform.
Terrific. Okay, well, thank you, Peter. Again, if there are any more last minute questions, please throw them out there. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. Again, we've got more Peter coming up. And if you've got questions that you didn't get to answer on this one, please feel free to call our help desk and we will be happy to help you out. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again, Peter.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.